In the quiet corners of Renaissance Europe, where cobblestone streets echoed with the gentle clip-clop of horse hooves and church bells marked the slow passage of time, there existed a profession that carried with it an air of mystery and unexpected peril. The perfume maker, or parfumer as they were known in the French courts, lived a life that from the outside appeared glamorous and refined, yet beneath the surface lay dangers that would make even the most adventurous soul pause with concern. Picture, if you will, the year 1543 in the bustling city of Florence, Italy. The morning mist clings to the Arno River as merchants begin their daily routines. Among them, in a narrow workshop, tucked between a baker and a cloth merchant, sits our perfume maker, Giovanni di Marco. His weathered hands, stained permanently with the residue of countless botanical experiments, carefully measure out ingredients that have traveled thousands of miles to reach his modest laboratory. The Renaissance period, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, was a time of rebirth and rediscovery. Ancient texts were being translated, trade routes were expanding, and with them came exotic ingredients previously unknown to European craftsmen. For the perfume maker, this era represented both unprecedented opportunity and equally unprecedented risk. Giovanni's workshop, like most perfume-making establishments of the time, was a cramped affair. The ceiling hung low, barely 7 feet high, and the single window provided the only source of natural light. Along the walls, wooden shelves sagged under the weight of ceramic jars, glass vials, and metal containers, each holding ingredients that ranged from the merely expensive to the absolutely lethal. The process of creating perfume in the Renaissance was nothing like the sterile, scientific procedures we know today. There were no safety regulations, no understanding of toxicology, and certainly no protective equipment. A perfume maker worked with bare hands, breathing in whatever vapors his concoctions produced, often tasting ingredients to determine their quality and potency. Let us begin with the ingredients themselves, for it was here that the first dangers lurked. The Renaissance perfume maker's palette included not just the flowers and herbs we might expect, but also a startling array of substances that modern science would classify as highly toxic. Mercury, for instance, was prized for its ability to preserve other ingredients and was believed to have purifying properties. Giovanni would handle liquid mercury with his bare hands, watching it form perfect silvery beads as it rolled across his workbench, completely unaware that each handling was slowly poisoning his nervous system. The mercury came to Giovanni's workshop in small glass ampoules, carefully wrapped in cloth, and transported from the mines of Almaden in Spain or Idrija in what is now Slovenia. The miners who extracted this mercury often died young, their bodies racked with tremors and their minds clouded by the very substance they pulled from the earth. But this knowledge never reached the perfume makers who eagerly purchased their silvery treasure, believing it to be a gift from the gods themselves. Giovanni would use mercury in a process he called fixing the essence, where he would combine the liquid metal with various plant extracts, believing that the mercury would capture and preserve the most volatile aromatic compounds. He would heat these mixtures gently over a low flame, watching as the mercury danced and shimmered in the ceramic crucible, releasing vapors that glittered in the lamplight like fairy dust. What he was actually creating was a cloud of mercury vapor that he inhaled with each breath, each molecule finding its way into his bloodstream and eventually settling in his brain and kidneys. The symptoms of mercury poisoning developed so gradually that Giovanni attributed them to other causes. The slight tremor that began in his hands he blamed on age, though he was only 37 years old. The increasing difficulty he had remembering formulas he dismissed as the natural result of working with so many complex recipes. The metallic taste that never quite left his mouth he thought was simply an occupational hazard, like the flour dust that perpetually coated the baker next door. Lead compounds were another favorite among perfume makers of the era. Lead acetate, known as sugar of lead due to its sweet taste, was used to create white pigments for powdered cosmetics that often accompanied perfume sales. The powder was so fine that it hung in the air like flour dust, and Giovanni would breathe it in for hours at a time. The sweet taste on his lips as he worked was actually the first sign of lead poisoning, though he interpreted it merely as a pleasant side effect of his craft. The lead came from mines scattered across Europe, from the hills of Derbyshire in England to the mountains of the Harz region in what is now Germany. The miners who extracted these lead ores often suffered from what they called painter's colic or dry bellyache, not understanding that their symptoms were caused by the very metal they mined. The lead was processed into various compounds by alchemists and metalworkers who had learned their trade through Generations of trial and error, passing down techniques without understanding the underlying chemistry or the health implications of their work. In Giovanni's workshop, lead acetate was prepared by dissolving sheets of lead in vinegar, a process that could take weeks to complete. The lead sheets, hammered thin by craftsmen, whose own hands bore the telltale blue line of lead poisoning along their gums, would slowly dissolve in the acidic vinegar, creating a solution that Giovanni would then evaporate to produce crystals of lead acetate. These crystals, perfectly white and sweetly flavored, seemed like the embodiment of purity to the Renaissance mind, which associated whiteness with cleanliness and godliness. Giovanni would grind these crystals into an incredibly fine powder using a mortar and pestle, creating clouds of lead dust that settled on every surface in his workshop. The powder was so fine that it became embedded in the wooden surfaces, the fabric of his clothes, and the pores of his skin. Every breath he took during the grinding process introduced more lead into his system, and every meal he ate with unwashed hands added to his body's burden of this toxic metal. Arsenic, perhaps the most notorious poison in history, found its way into Renaissance perfume workshops in the form of orpiment, a brilliant yellow mineral used to create golden hues in cosmetic preparations. The arsenic would slowly accumulate in Giovanni's body with each exposure, causing his hair to thin and his fingernails to develop distinctive white lines, symptoms he attributed to the natural aging process rather than slow poisoning. Orpiment came primarily from mines in Turkey, Persia, and the distant mountains of Asia, transported along the same trade routes that brought silk and spices to European markets. The merchants who handled orpiment often knew of its poisonous properties, having observed its effects on both vermin and humans, but this knowledge was not systematically shared with the craftsmen who used it in their work. To Giovanni, orpiment was simply another mineral with useful properties, as natural and benign as any other gift from the earth. The process of preparing orpiment for use in cosmetics required grinding the mineral into an extremely fine powder, a task that Giovanni would perform in a small, poorly ventilated alcove of his workshop. He would place chunks of the bright yellow mineral in a bronze mortar and slowly reduce them to powder, the grinding process releasing tiny particles into the air that glittered like gold dust in the lamplight. These particles, laden with arsenic, would settle in his lungs and on his skin, where they would slowly be absorbed into his bloodstream. Giovanni had developed what he considered an efficient technique for grinding orpiment, using a special pestle that he had inherited from his master. The pestle, made of particularly hard stone, could reduce even the most stubborn minerals to powder, but it also created finer particles that were more easily inhaled. He took pride in his ability to create orpiment powder so fine that it seemed to float in the air like yellow smoke, not realizing that this very fineness made it more dangerous to his health. But it was not just the heavy metals that posed a threat. The Renaissance perfume maker worked extensively with what we now know as essential oils, but the extraction methods of the time were crude and dangerous. The process of distillation, used to extract fragrances from plant materials, required maintaining fires under metal vessels for hours or even days at a time. These workshops, constructed entirely of wood with thatched roofs, were essentially tinderboxes waiting for a spark. Giovanni's distillation apparatus consisted of a large copper alembic, a device that would not have looked out of place in an alchemist's laboratory. The copper vessel, which he had purchased from a metalworker in Venice at considerable expense, sat over an open flame, fueled by charcoal or wood. The apparatus included a series of copper tubes and condensing chambers that allowed him to separate and collect different fractions of the distilled material, but the entire system was heated by an open fire that required constant attention. The charcoal that Giovanni used for his distillation work came from specialized charcoal burners, who lived in the forests outside Florence. These men spent their lives in smoky huts, slowly burning wood in carefully controlled conditions to produce the steady burning charcoal that craftsmen required. The charcoal they produced burned cleaner than wood, but it still released carbon monoxide and other toxic gases, especially when burned in the poorly ventilated confines of Giovanni's workshop. During the distillation process, Giovanni would tend his fires for 12, 16, sometimes even 24 hours at a stretch, constantly adjusting the flames to maintain the precise temperature needed for optimal extraction. The copper alembic would grow hot enough to cause serious burns if touched carelessly, and the vapors that rose from the heated plant materials could be intoxicating, hallucinogenic, or poisonous, depending on what was being processed. As the plant materials inside the alembic heated up, they released not just the desired aromatic compounds, but also potentially toxic vapors. Different plants release different hazards that Giovanni had no way of anticipating or understanding. Distilling bitter almonds, for instance, produced hydrogen cyanide gas, the same compound used in modern gas chambers. Giovanni had no way of knowing this, of course. He simply knew that working with bitter almonds sometimes made him feel dizzy and nauseous, symptoms he attributed to working too hard without proper meals. The bitter almonds that Giovanni used came from trees that grew wild in the hills around Florence and from cultivated orchards in the countryside beyond the city walls. Unlike sweet almonds, which were safe to eat, bitter almonds contained compounds called glycosides that broke down under heat to produce hydrogen cyanide. The amount of cyanide produced during distillation was usually not enough to cause immediate death, but it was sufficient to cause chronic poisoning symptoms that Giovanni experienced regularly without understanding their cause. Giovanni had developed what he considered a foolproof method for determining when the bitter almond distillation was complete. He would lean over the alembic and breathe deeply, judging the concentration of aromatic compounds by their intensity. What he was actually doing was deliberately inhaling cyanide gas, a practice that gradually damaged his body's ability to process oxygen at the cellular level. The chronic fatigue that plagued him in his later years was partly due to this cellular damage, though he attributed it to the natural effects of aging and hard work. Other plants presented their own unique hazards during distillation. Foxglove, prized for its delicate floral scent, contained powerful cardiac glycosides that could cause heart arrhythmias when absorbed through the lungs. Giovanni often distilled foxglove during the spring months, when the flowers were at their peak, not knowing that the vapors he was breathing could cause his heart to skip beats or race uncontrollably. The foxglove that Giovanni used grew in abundance in the meadows and forest clearings around Florence, where he would gather it himself during early morning expeditions outside the city walls. He had learned to identify the best plants by their size and the intensity of their fragrance, selecting only the finest specimens for his distillations. The flowers, with their distinctive bell shape and spotted throats, seemed perfectly designed by nature for the creation of beautiful perfumes, and Giovanni felt a deep connection to the natural world as he gathered them in the pre-dawn light. The distillation of foxglove required particularly careful attention to temperature control, as too much heat would destroy the delicate aromatic compounds while too little would fail to extract them completely. Giovanni would maintain his fires at what he judged to be the perfect temperature for hours at a time, breathing the digitalis-laden vapors that rose from his apparatus. The irregular heartbeat that began to plague him in his 40s he attributed to excitement about his work or anxiety about business concerns, never suspecting that it was caused by the very flowers he loved to work with. Wormwood, another favorite of Renaissance perfume makers, presented its own set of hazards. This bitter herb, used to create complex, sophisticated fragrances for wealthy patrons, contained compounds that could cause hallucinations and seizures when present in sufficient quantities. Giovanni often experienced vivid dreams and occasional periods of confusion after working with wormwood, effects he attributed to divine inspiration or spiritual enlightenment, rather than chemical intoxication. The wormwood that Giovanni used came from two sources: wild plants that he gathered from abandoned fields and roadsides around Florence, and cultivated varieties that he purchased from herbalists in the city's markets. The wild wormwood was generally more potent, having grown in poor soil under stressful conditions that concentrated its active compounds. Giovanni preferred the wild varieties for their intensity, not knowing that this same intensity made them more dangerous to work with. Preparing wormwood for distillation required careful drying and processing to preserve its aromatic qualities while preventing spoilage. Giovanni would harvest the herb at specific times of the lunar cycle, believing that the moon's phases affected the plant's potency. He would then dry the wormwood in bundles hung from the rafters of his workshop, where the dried herb would release its volatile compounds into the air over a period of weeks or months. The workshop's ventilation was poor by design. Perfume makers believed that allowing too much air circulation would cause their precious aromatic compounds to escape, reducing the potency of their final products. As a result, toxic vapors would accumulate in the small spaces, creating an atmosphere that was slowly but surely detrimental to human health. Giovanni's workshop, like most others of its kind, had only one small window and a single door, both of which were usually kept closed during distillation work to prevent the loss of valuable vapors. The accumulated vapors in Giovanni's workshop created a complex mixture of aromatic compounds, toxic gases, and particulate matter that hung in the air like an invisible fog. Over time, these substances would condense on the surfaces of the workshop, creating a thin film of concentrated essences and toxins on every wall, shelf, and tool. Giovanni's clothes, hair, and skin would absorb these compounds, carrying them home with him each evening and exposing his family to many of the same dangers he faced in his workplace. Temperature control was another constant challenge that brought its own dangers. The process of creating certain perfumes required heating ingredients to very specific temperatures, but Renaissance-era perfume makers had no thermometers. They judged temperature by touch, by the sound of bubbling liquids, and by the color of flames. This meant that Giovanni regularly burned his hands on hot metal surfaces, and accidents involving boiling liquids were common. Burns were treated with remedies that often made the situation worse, such as applying pig fat or even mercury-based ointments to the wounds. Giovanni had developed what he considered to be sophisticated techniques for judging temperature without the benefit of modern instruments. He could tell the temperature of his distillation apparatus by watching the color and behavior of the flames beneath it, by listening to the sounds that the boiling liquids made inside the copper vessels, and by observing the rate at which vapors condensed in the cooling chambers. These techniques required him to work in close proximity to hot surfaces and open flames, exposing him to constant risk of burns and other heat-related injuries. When accidents did occur, Giovanni treated them with remedies that reflected the medical understanding of his time. Burns were often treated with applications of pig fat, butter, or oil, substances that actually trapped heat in the skin and often made the injuries worse. More serious burns might be treated with poultices containing various herbs and minerals, some of which had genuine healing properties while others were useless or even harmful. The pig fat that Giovanni used to treat burns came from the butcher shops of Florence, where it was a common byproduct of meat processing. The fat was often rancid by the time it reached Giovanni's workshop, having been stored in warm conditions without refrigeration for days or weeks. Applying rancid fat to an open wound invited infection, but Giovanni had learned this technique from his master and trusted it implicitly, having no access to better alternatives. The sourcing of ingredients brought dangers that extended far beyond the workshop walls. Exotic materials like ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the digestive system of sperm whales, were incredibly valuable and therefore attracted the attention of thieves and pirates. Perfume makers often traveled personally to negotiate for rare ingredients, journeying through bandit-infested forests and politically unstable regions where a single mistake could mean death. Ambergris was perhaps the most prized ingredient in the Renaissance perfume makers' arsenal, worth more than its weight in gold and capable of transforming even the most ordinary fragrance into something extraordinary. This mysterious substance, which washed up on beaches around the world as gray or black lumps that resembled rocks or tar, was actually a form of whale excrement that had been aged in the ocean for years or decades. Giovanni had only seen genuine ambergris a few times in his career, and each encounter had required negotiations with merchants whose own sources were shrouded in secrecy and danger. The ambergris trade was controlled by a small network of dealers who specialized in obtaining rare and exotic materials for craftsmen and alchemists across Europe. These dealers often risked their lives traveling to remote coasts where ambergris might wash ashore, competing with local beachcombers and sometimes facing violence from those who wanted to control the trade. The journey to obtain ambergris could take Giovanni far from the relative safety of Florence, into regions where bandits preyed on travelers and where political instability made any journey dangerous. The roads of Renaissance Europe were poorly maintained and often impassable during bad weather, forcing travelers to take detours through even more dangerous territory. Bridges were rare and often in poor repair, making river crossings treacherous affairs that could result in drowning or the loss of valuable cargo. Giovanni remembered one particular journey to the port city of Venice, where he had arranged to meet a dealer who claimed to have obtained a piece of ambergris from a beach in distant Norway. The journey from Florence to Venice required crossing the Apennine Mountains along roads that were little more than dirt tracks, vulnerable to landslides, avalanches, and attacks by the bandits who made their living preying on merchants and travelers. The weather during Giovanni's journey had been unseasonably harsh, with late spring snows that made the mountain passes treacherous and cold that numbed his hands until he could barely grip the reins of his horse. He had traveled with a small group of other merchants for safety, but their presence also made them a more attractive target for bandits, who preferred to attack groups that might be carrying valuable goods rather than risk attacking individual travelers who might have little worth stealing. When Giovanni finally reached Venice, he found that the dealer he had arranged to meet had been arrested by the city's authorities on charges of smuggling and tax evasion. The ambergris that Giovanni had hoped to purchase had been confiscated as evidence, and Giovanni was forced to return to Florence empty-handed after weeks of dangerous travel and considerable expense. The experience taught him that the pursuit of rare ingredients carried risks that extended far beyond the physical dangers of his workshop. Musk, another highly prized ingredient, came from the musk deer of Asia and required dangerous hunting expeditions. The trade routes that brought these materials to Europe were fraught with peril, and perfume makers who insisted on personally overseeing their supply chains faced risks from storms at sea, attacks by raiders, and diseases for which they had no immunity. The musk that Giovanni occasionally managed to obtain came from a species of deer that lived in the remote mountains of Tibet and Central Asia, animals that were hunted by specialized hunters who risked their lives in some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The musk itself was contained in a gland that had to be removed from male deer during specific times of the year when the scent was most potent, a process that required considerable skill and experience. The hunters who obtained musk lived nomadic lives in regions where winter temperatures could drop to deadly levels and where altitude sickness could kill the unprepared. They used techniques passed down through generations, following deer herds across landscapes that could change from lush meadows to barren rock fields within the space of a few miles. The successful hunters were hardy men who could survive for weeks in the wilderness with minimal supplies, tracking their prey across terrain that would defeat most travelers. The musk that these hunters obtained was traded through a complex network of merchants who transported it across thousands of miles of some of the most dangerous territory in the world. The trade routes passed through regions controlled by various kingdoms and empires, each of which imposed its own taxes and regulations on merchants. Political instability in any of these regions could disrupt the musk trade for years at a time, making it one of the most unreliable and expensive ingredients in the perfume maker's arsenal. Even within the relative safety of Italian city-states, the perfume trade was connected to political intrigue and assassination. Perfume makers were often employed by noble families not just to create pleasant fragrances, but also to develop poisons that could be administered through cosmetics or perfumed gloves. Catherine de' Medici, who became Queen of France, was rumored to have maintained a perfume laboratory where fragrances and poisons were developed side by side. Perfume makers who became involved in such schemes, willingly or not, often found themselves targets for elimination once their usefulness had ended. The connection between perfume making and poison making was not accidental. Many of the same skills and materials used to create beautiful fragrances could be applied to the creation of deadly poisons. The distillation techniques used to extract aromatic compounds from flowers could also be used to concentrate toxic alkaloids from poisonous plants. The knowledge of chemistry required to blend different aromatic compounds into harmonious fragrances was essentially the same knowledge needed to create poisons that would be undetectable until it was too late. Giovanni had heard rumors of perfume makers in other cities who had been recruited by powerful families to create special products for political purposes. These craftsmen were well paid for their discretion and skill, but they also lived with the constant knowledge that they possessed information that could be dangerous to powerful people. Many such craftsmen met untimely deaths, officially from accidents or natural causes, but often under circumstances that suggested more sinister explanations. The Medici family, which ruled Florence during much of Giovanni's lifetime, was known for their patronage of arts and sciences, but they were also notorious for their involvement in political intrigue and their willingness to eliminate enemies through any means necessary. Giovanni had occasionally received requests from people connected to the Medici court for special fragrances or cosmetic preparations, requests that came with instructions for unusual ingredients or techniques that made him uncomfortable. One such request had come through an intermediary who claimed to represent a wealthy widow seeking a special perfume to help her attract a new husband. The ingredients specified in the request included several plants that Giovanni knew were toxic, combined in proportions that seemed designed to cause illness rather than to create a pleasant fragrance. Giovanni had declined the commission, claiming that he lacked the necessary ingredients, but the experience had left him wondering about the true purpose of the request and whether he had made an enemy by refusing. The workshop itself presented constant physical dangers beyond the chemical hazards. The heavy ceramic and glass containers used to store ingredients were precariously stacked on Wooden shelves that sagged and sometimes collapsed without warning. Sharp tools were everywhere, from the knives used to chop plant materials to the metal implements used to crush and grind ingredients. Poor lighting meant that cuts and injuries were common, and in an age before antiseptics, even minor wounds could become infected and life-threatening. Giovanni's workshop was crammed with equipment and materials that reflected decades of accumulated tools and ingredients. The wooden shelves that lined the walls had been built by previous occupants of the space and were not designed to hold the weight of the heavy ceramic jars and metal containers that Giovanni used to store his materials. Over time, the shelves had begun to sag under the weight, and Giovanni had reinforced them with additional supports, but the entire storage system remained precarious. The jars and containers themselves represented a significant investment and were often irreplaceable if broken. Giovanni had inherited some of his storage vessels from his master, while others he had purchased from craftsmen in Florence or during his travels to other cities. Each container had its own history and character, from the large ceramic jars that held bulk quantities of dried herbs to the small glass vials that contained the most precious and concentrated essences. The glass vials were particularly precious and particularly fragile, made by skilled glassworkers. In Venice or other centers of glass production, these vessels were expensive and often took weeks or months to replace if broken. Giovanni handled them with extreme care, but accidents were inevitable in a workshop where many different tasks were performed in a cramped space with poor lighting. When a valuable vial broke, it often meant not just the loss of the container, but also the loss of whatever precious substance it contained. Sharp tools were an essential part of Giovanni's equipment, but they also represented a constant source of danger. Knives for chopping plant materials had to be kept extremely sharp, to cut cleanly through tough roots and stems without crushing the delicate cellular structures that contained aromatic compounds. These same knives could easily cause serious cuts if handled carelessly, especially in the dim lighting of the workshop where shadows could hide the position of a blade. The grinding and crushing tools that Giovanni used to process minerals and dried plant materials were often improvised from whatever was available. Mortars and pestles came in various sizes and materials, from small bronze sets for delicate work to large stone implements for processing bulk quantities of material. The pestles had to be heavy enough to crush tough materials, but their weight also made them dangerous if dropped or mishandled. Giovanni's daily routine began before dawn, when he would light the oil lamps that provided illumination for his work. The lamps themselves were a fire hazard, especially in a workshop filled with flammable liquids and vapors. The oil used in these lamps was often rancid, producing toxic smoke that added to the already dangerous atmosphere of the workspace. The oil that fueled Giovanni's lamps came from various sources, depending on what was available and affordable at any given time. Olive oil was preferred when it could be obtained, as it burned more cleanly than other alternatives, but it was also expensive and often in short supply. More commonly, Giovanni used oil from nuts, seeds, or fish, substances that were cheaper but produced more smoke and odor when burned. The lamps themselves were simple devices made of bronze or ceramic, with wicks made from twisted plant fibers that drew oil up from a reservoir and burned with a small, flickering flame. These flames provided barely enough light for detailed work, forcing Giovanni to lean close to whatever he was doing and exposing him to the heat and smoke produced by the burning oil. The soot from the lamps gradually coated every surface in the workshop, mixing with the other substances in the air to create a grimy film that was difficult to clean and potentially toxic. During the winter months, when daylight was scarce and the workshop was cold, Giovanni would keep multiple lamps burning throughout the day to provide both light and warmth. The combined heat from several lamps could raise the temperature in the small workshop significantly, but it also increased the fire risk and the concentration of smoke and soot in the air. The need for light and warmth had to be balanced against the dangers of fire and air pollution, a calculation that Giovanni made instinctively based on years of experience. The grinding and preparation of ingredients created clouds of fine dust that hung in the air for hours. When working with materials like dried flowers or powdered roots, this might seem harmless enough, but many of the plants used in Renaissance perfumery were toxic when inhaled. Foxglove, used for certain floral notes, contains digitalis compounds that can cause heart problems when absorbed through the lungs. Wormwood, prized for its bitter, complex aroma, contains compounds that can cause hallucinations and seizures when present in sufficient quantities. The process of grinding dried plant materials was one of the most time-consuming and potentially dangerous aspects of Giovanni's work. Different plants required different approaches. And Giovanni had developed specialized techniques for each type of material he worked with. Delicate flower petals could be reduced to powder with gentle pressure, while tough roots and bark required vigorous grinding that could take hours to complete. The dust created during grinding operations was so fine that it seemed to hang in the air indefinitely, creating a haze that reduced visibility and made breathing difficult. Giovanni had learned to work with a cloth tied over his nose and mouth during particularly dusty operations. But this simple protection was inadequate to prevent him from inhaling significant quantities of potentially toxic particles. Different types of dust presented different hazards, many of which Giovanni was completely unaware of. The dust from digitalis plants could cause cardiac arrhythmias, while dust from plants in the nightshade family could cause nervous system problems. Even seemingly harmless plants could produce dust that irritated the lungs and respiratory system, causing chronic coughing and breathing difficulties that Giovanni accepted as normal occupational hazards. The lack of understanding about chemical interactions meant that perfume makers regularly combined substances that we now know should never be mixed. Giovanni might combine acids with metals, creating toxic gases, or mix different plant extracts without realizing that some combinations could produce poisonous compounds. The Renaissance perfume maker was essentially conducting uncontrolled chemical experiments every single day, with his own body serving as the test subject for any harmful effects. Giovanni's approach to blending ingredients was based on traditional recipes passed down from his master, combined with his own experimentation and intuition. He had no understanding of chemical reactions in the modern sense, thinking of his work more in terms of balancing humors and achieving harmony between different substances. This meant that he would often combine ingredients based on their supposed spiritual or mystical properties rather than their chemical compatibility. Some combinations that Giovanni regularly used were actually quite dangerous, though he had no way of knowing this. Mixing certain plant acids with metal containers could produce toxic gases that built up in the poorly ventilated workshop. Combining different plant extracts could sometimes produce new compounds that were more toxic than either original ingredient. Even mixing different oils could sometimes result in reactions that produced irritating or harmful vapors. Giovanni's lack of knowledge about chemistry meant that he often interpreted the effects of dangerous combinations as signs that his work was proceeding correctly. If a mixture produced unusual vapors or caused him to feel dizzy, he might interpret this as evidence that the blend was particularly potent or spiritually significant. The Renaissance worldview encouraged such interpretations, as many people believed that the most powerful substances were also the most dangerous and that some degree of risk was necessary to achieve extraordinary results. Water quality was another significant concern. The water used in perfume making came from wells, rivers, or cisterns that were often contaminated with bacteria, heavy metals, or sewage. This contaminated water was used not just in the perfume making process, but also for cleaning equipment and sometimes even for drinking during long work sessions. Cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases were constant threats. The water that Giovanni used in his workshop came from a well that served several buildings in his neighborhood, a well that had been dug decades earlier and had never been properly maintained. The well water was often cloudy and had a metallic taste that Giovanni attributed to the minerals in the earth, not realizing that the taste came from contamination by sewage and industrial waste that seeped into the groundwater from nearby workshops and houses. During the summer months, when rainfall was scarce and the water level in the well dropped, the concentration of contaminants increased significantly. The water would sometimes develop a foul odor or an oily film on its surface, signs that Giovanni learned to recognize as indicators that the water needed to be boiled before use. However, boiling water over an open fire in his workshop increased the fire risk and added to the heat and humidity that made working conditions uncomfortable. Giovanni also used river water for some of his work, particularly for cleaning equipment and for processes that required large quantities of water. The Arno River, which flowed through Florence, served as both a source of water and a disposal site for the city's waste. Tanneries, dye works, and other industries dumped their waste into the river, creating a toxic mixture that Giovanni would use without any understanding of its dangers. The river water was often visibly polluted, with colors and odors that reflected the various industries that used it for waste disposal. Giovanni had learned to collect water from certain points along the river where it seemed cleaner, but even the cleanest river water was contaminated with bacteria and chemicals that could cause serious illness. The waterborne Diseases that periodically swept through Florence often originated from the contaminated water. That residents used for drinking, cooking, and industrial purposes. The economic pressures faced by Renaissance perfume makers also contributed to the dangers of their profession. Competition was fierce, and there was constant pressure to create new and more exotic fragrances to attract wealthy patrons. This led perfume makers to experiment with increasingly dangerous and unusual ingredients. Some would try to create fragrances using the secretions of various animals, often without understanding the diseases these animals might carry. Others would experiment with minerals and metals, grinding them into powders that release toxic dust into the air. Giovanni faced constant financial pressure to produce perfumes that would appeal to the wealthy merchants and nobles who made up his customer base. These customers were always seeking something new and unusual, something that would set them apart from their rivals and demonstrate their sophistication and wealth. This demand for novelty pushed Giovanni to experiment with ever more exotic and dangerous ingredients, often obtained at great expense and considerable risk. The competition among perfume makers in Florence was particularly intense, as the city was home to dozens of craftsmen who served the same relatively small population of wealthy customers. Success in this competitive environment required not just skill in creating pleasant fragrances, but also the ability to obtain rare ingredients and develop unique formulations that could not be easily copied by competitors. Giovanni's customers often made specific requests for fragrances that incorporated particular ingredients or achieved certain effects. A merchant might request a perfume that would make him seem more trustworthy in business negotiations, while a noble might want a fragrance that would enhance his reputation for sophistication and refinement. These requests often required Giovanni to work with unfamiliar ingredients or attempt techniques that he had never tried before. The pressure to satisfy demanding customers sometimes led Giovanni to take shortcuts or use ingredients that he knew were dangerous. If a customer specifically requested a fragrance that included a particular toxic plant, Giovanni might be reluctant to refuse the commission, especially if the customer was wealthy and influential. The economic consequences of losing important customers could be severe enough to outweigh the health risks of working with dangerous materials. Apprentices in perfume workshops faced particular dangers. Young people, sometimes as young as 10 or 12 years old, were sent to work in these toxic environments without any understanding of the risks they faced. They were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as tending the fires under distillation equipment or handling the most caustic substances. Because their small hands were better suited to delicate work, many apprentices developed health problems that would plague them for life if they lived long enough to become master perfumers themselves. Giovanni had taken on several apprentices during his career, young boys whose families hoped that learning the perfume trade would provide them with a prosperous future. The apprenticeship system was the primary way that skills were transmitted from one generation to the next, and Giovanni took his responsibilities as a master seriously, trying to teach his apprentices not just the technical aspects of perfume making, but also the business skills they would need to succeed as independent craftsmen. However, Giovanni's understanding of the dangers associated with his trade was limited, and he often exposed his apprentices to the same risks that he faced himself without realizing the potential consequences. Young people were particularly vulnerable to the effects of toxic substances, as their developing bodies were less able to process and eliminate harmful compounds. Many of the symptoms that Giovanni attributed to the natural process of learning a difficult trade were actually signs of chronic poisoning. The apprentices who worked in Giovanni's shop were typically the sons of craftsmen or merchants who could afford to pay for their training, or occasionally orphaned boys who were placed in apprenticeships by charitable organizations. These young people often came from families with little understanding of the perfume trade, and they trusted Giovanni to provide safe working conditions and appropriate training. The tasks assigned to apprentices were often the most physically demanding and dangerous aspects of perfume making. Young apprentices would spend hours tending fires, breathing smoke and toxic vapors while maintaining the precise temperatures needed for distillation. They would grind toxic minerals into fine powders, clean equipment with caustic solutions, and handle dangerous substances without any protective equipment or safety training. Many apprentices developed chronic health problems during their training that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Respiratory problems were common, caused by years of breathing dust and vapors in poorly ventilated workshops. Skin conditions often developed from contact with caustic substances, while nervous system damage could result from exposure to heavy metals, and toxic plants. Giovanni attributed these problems to the hardships of learning a difficult trade, not realizing that they were preventable consequences of unsafe working conditions. The preservation of finished perfumes presented its own set of challenges and dangers. Without modern preservatives, perfume makers relied on alcohol and various mineral compounds to prevent their products from spoiling. However, the alcohol used was often of poor quality and contained toxic impurities. The mineral preservatives, such as various salts of heavy metals, were toxic in their own right. The alcohol that Giovanni used as a base for his liquid perfumes was distilled from wine or grain by specialized craftsmen who operated primitive stills that were incapable of producing pure alcohol. The resulting product was typically only about 60 to 70% alcohol by volume, with the remainder consisting of water and various impurities that could affect both the quality and safety of the final perfume. The impurities in Renaissance-era alcohol included various organic compounds that were produced during the fermentation and distillation process, some of which were toxic in significant concentrations. Methanol, which could cause blindness and death if consumed in sufficient quantities, was a common contaminant in poorly distilled alcohol. Other impurities could cause skin irritation or allergic reactions when the alcohol was used as a base for perfumes that would be applied to the skin. Giovanni often distilled his own alcohol using a small copper still that he had purchased from a craftsman who specialized in distillation equipment. The process required careful attention to temperature control and timing, as overheating could produce toxic compounds while underheating would result in weak alcohol that would not effectively preserve his perfumes. The distillation process also required hours of tending an open fire, adding to the fire risk in his already dangerous workshop. The mineral preservatives that Giovanni used were typically salts of various metals that were believed to have antimicrobial properties. These included compounds of mercury, lead, and arsenic, substances that we now know are highly toxic but which were considered beneficial. During the Renaissance, Giovanni would dissolve these metal salts in his perfumes to prevent bacterial growth and spoilage, not realizing that he was creating products that could cause serious health problems for his customers. Storage was particularly problematic during the hot summer months. Perfumes stored in poorly ventilated areas could ferment or undergo chemical changes that made them dangerous to use. There are recorded cases of perfumes that caused chemical burns when applied to the skin, the result of degradation that transformed relatively harmless ingredients into caustic compounds. Giovanni's workshop had no controlled storage area for finished perfumes, and he was forced to keep his products in the same space where he conducted his manufacturing operations. During the summer months, when temperatures in the workshop could exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat would accelerate chemical reactions in stored perfumes, sometimes producing new compounds that were more toxic than the original ingredients. The containers used for storing finished perfumes were often made of materials that could react with the contents over time. Ceramic jars glazed with lead-based glazes could leach toxic metals into acidic perfumes, while metal containers could corrode and contaminate their contents with rust and other oxidation products. Even glass containers, which were generally the safest option, could sometimes contain impurities that would affect the stored perfumes. Giovanni had learned through experience to recognize the signs that a stored perfume had undergone dangerous changes. A change in color, the development of an unusual odor, or the formation of crystals or precipitates could all indicate that a perfume had become unsafe to use. However, these visual and olfactory indicators were not always reliable, and Giovanni sometimes sold products that had undergone subtle changes that made them dangerous, without obvious signs of deterioration. The social aspects of the perfume trade also brought unique dangers. Perfume makers often worked closely with the nobility and wealthy merchant classes, groups that were frequently involved in political conspiracies and power struggles. A perfume maker might find himself caught in the middle of a plot simply because he had access to the private chambers of important people. The knowledge of personal habits and preferences that perfume makers gained through their work made them valuable sources of information for those with malicious intent. Giovanni's customer base included some of the most powerful and influential people in Florence, individuals whose personal and political lives were often complex and dangerous. As their perfume maker, Giovanni had intimate knowledge of their personal habits, their health problems, and their relationships with other people. This knowledge, while necessary for his work, also made him a potential target for those who wanted to gather information about his Customers. The perfume maker's role often extended beyond simply creating fragrances. Customers would confide in Giovanni about their personal problems, seek his advice on matters related to health and beauty, and sometimes ask him to create special products for specific purposes. This intimate relationship between perfume maker and customer could be dangerous if Giovanni inadvertently learned information that others wanted to keep secret. Political alliances in Renaissance Florence were constantly shifting, and individuals who were powerful and influential one day could find themselves in exile or prison the next. Giovanni's association with particular customers could become a liability if those customers fell from favor or became involved in political conspiracies. The guilt by association that characterized Renaissance politics meant that anyone connected to a disgraced individual could also face punishment. Giovanni had witnessed the consequences of political instability firsthand when one of his most important customers, a wealthy merchant who had been involved in financing various political activities, was suddenly arrested and charged with treason. The merchant's property was confiscated, his business associates were investigated, and several people who had worked for him were imprisoned or exiled. Giovanni had been questioned by the authorities about his relationship with the merchant, and although he was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, the experience had taught him to be cautious about becoming too closely involved with his customers' personal affairs. Religious persecution was another threat that Renaissance perfume makers faced. The Catholic Church was suspicious of any craft that seemed too closely related to alchemy or witchcraft, and perfume making, with its mysterious processes and exotic ingredients, often fell under scrutiny. Perfume makers who used ingredients that were considered magical or who employed processes that seemed too similar to occult practices could find themselves accused of heresy or witchcraft. The relationship between perfume making and alchemy was particularly problematic from the Church's perspective. Both crafts involved the transformation of natural materials through the application of heat and chemical processes, and both required knowledge of the properties of various substances and their interactions. The equipment used by perfume makers, with its complex arrangements of vessels, tubes, and condensers, was virtually identical to that used by alchemists. Giovanni had been careful to avoid any association with practices that might be considered magical or heretical, but the line between legitimate perfume making and prohibited activities was often unclear. The use of certain ingredients, particularly those associated with ancient pagan traditions or folk magic, could be interpreted as evidence of involvement in witchcraft. Even the timing of certain operations, such as gathering herbs during specific phases of the moon, could be seen as suspicious if reported to religious authorities. The Inquisition, which was active in various parts of Europe during Giovanni's lifetime, was particularly concerned with rooting out practices that were considered heretical or magical. Perfume makers who came to the attention of Inquisition investigators could face interrogation, imprisonment, and even execution if they were found guilty of heretical practices. The fear of such persecution led many perfume makers to be extremely cautious about their public behavior, and to avoid any activities that might be misinterpreted. Giovanni had heard stories of perfume makers in other cities who had been arrested and charged with witchcraft, often based on little more than the testimony of competitors or dissatisfied customers. The accusation of witchcraft was particularly dangerous because it was almost impossible to disprove, and the investigative methods used by religious authorities often involved torture and other coercive techniques that could force innocent people to confess to crimes they had not committed. The guild system that governed most trades during the Renaissance also created its own pressures and dangers. Perfume makers who violated guild rules or who tried to practice their craft without proper authorization could face severe penalties, including imprisonment or exile. Competition between guilds sometimes turned violent, and perfume makers could find themselves targets of attacks by members of rival organizations. The Guild of Apothecaries in Florence, which regulated perfume making along with other trades involving the preparation of medicines and cosmetics, maintained strict control over who could practice these crafts and under what conditions. Guild membership required payment of substantial fees, completion of a formal apprenticeship, and demonstration of competency through examinations and practical tests. Those who attempted to practice perfume making without guild authorization faced prosecution and punishment. Guild rules also governed many aspects of how perfume makers conducted their business, including what ingredients they could use, how they could advertise their services, and how much they could charge for their products. Violation of these rules could result in fines, suspension of guild membership, or even permanent expulsion from the trade. The guild also had the authority to inspect workshops and investigate complaints from customers, giving it considerable power over the daily operations of perfume makers. Competition between different guilds sometimes led to conflicts that affected individual craftsmen. The Guild of Apothecaries competed with other organizations for control over various aspects of the trade in medicines and cosmetics, and these jurisdictional disputes could result in legal battles that lasted for years. Individual perfume makers could find themselves caught in the middle of such disputes, forced to choose sides or risk losing the protection of their guild. Giovanni had been a member of the Guild of Apothecaries for most of his career, and he had generally found the organization to be beneficial in providing protection from unfair competition and assistance in resolving disputes with customers. However, he had also witnessed the darker side of guild politics, including instances where personal rivalries between guild members had led to false accusations and deliberate sabotage of competitors' businesses. International trade complications added another layer of risk to the profession. The ingredients that perfume makers relied upon came from all over the known world, and political upheavals, wars, or changes in trade relationships could suddenly cut off the supply of essential materials. Perfume makers who had invested heavily in rare ingredients could find themselves financially ruined overnight when trade routes were disrupted. The spice trade routes that brought exotic ingredients to Europe were subject to constant disruption from various causes. Wars between European powers could close off entire regions to trade, while conflicts in Asia or Africa could disrupt the supply of materials at their source. Pirates and bandits preyed on merchant caravans and ships, sometimes capturing entire shipments of valuable goods. Even natural disasters, such as storms that sank ships or earthquakes that blocked mountain passes, could disrupt trade for months or years at a time. Giovanni had experienced the consequences of trade disruptions several times during his career. On one occasion, a war between Venice and the Ottoman Empire had cut off the supply of several key ingredients that Giovanni relied upon for his most expensive perfumes. He had been forced to find substitutes or do without these materials for more than 2 years, a situation that had cost him several important customers who could not accept the changes in his formulations. The financial risks associated with international trade were compounded by the long delays between ordering materials and receiving them. Giovanni might place an order for expensive ingredients and pay for them in advance, only to learn months later that the shipment had been lost to pirates or destroyed by storms. The merchants who supplied these materials often demanded payment in advance and offered no guarantees that the goods would actually be delivered. Currency fluctuations and changes in trade regulations could also affect the cost and availability of imported ingredients. The value of different currencies varied constantly, and Giovanni often found that materials that had been affordable when he placed an order had become prohibitively expensive by the time they were delivered. Changes in import duties or trade restrictions could similarly affect the cost of doing business, sometimes making entire categories of ingredients too expensive to use. The process of creating custom fragrances for specific clients brought its own unique dangers. Wealthy patrons often had very specific and sometimes impossible demands, and perfume makers who failed to meet these expectations could face serious consequences. There are historical accounts of perfume makers being imprisoned or even executed for failing to create a fragrance that pleased a particularly demanding noble. Giovanni's most challenging commissions came from customers who had very specific ideas about what they wanted but little understanding of what was actually possible. A wealthy merchant might request a perfume that would make him irresistible to women, while a noble might want a fragrance that would demonstrate his power and authority. These requests often required Giovanni to attempt techniques that were beyond his capabilities or to use ingredients that were dangerous or impossible to obtain. The expectations of wealthy customers were often unrealistic, based on legends and superstitions rather than any understanding of what perfume could actually accomplish. Some customers believed that certain fragrances had magical properties, such as the ability to influence other people's thoughts or emotions. Others wanted perfumes that would cure diseases or provide protection from evil influences. Giovanni had learned to be diplomatic in explaining the limitations of his craft, but he sometimes felt pressured to promise results that he could not deliver. The consequences of disappointing an important customer could be severe. Wealthy patrons had the power to destroy a perfume maker's reputation through negative word of mouth, and they could also use their political influence to cause legal or financial problems for craftsmen who Who failed to meet their expectations? Giovanni had known perfume makers who had been forced to leave their cities after disappointing powerful customers, and he had heard stories of others who had faced even worse consequences. One of Giovanni's most difficult customers had been a noble who was convinced that a particular combination of ingredients would create a perfume with miraculous healing properties. The noble had provided Giovanni with a detailed recipe that he claimed had been passed down through his family for generations, but the recipe called for ingredients that were either impossible to obtain or dangerously toxic. Giovanni had tried to explain the problems with the recipe, but the noble had insisted that Giovanni follow it exactly as written. Giovanni had eventually been forced to create a modified version of the requested perfume, substituting safer ingredients for the most dangerous ones and omitting components that were simply unavailable. The noble had been furious when he discovered the modifications and had threatened to have Giovanni arrested for fraud and breach of contract. Only the intervention of other guild members had prevented the situation from escalating to serious legal consequences. Quality control was essentially non-existent in the Renaissance perfume industry. There were no standards for purity, potency, or safety, and perfume makers were free to use whatever ingredients they could obtain, regardless of their quality or origin. This meant that the final products could vary wildly in their effects on users, and perfume makers had no way of predicting whether a particular batch might cause allergic reactions, chemical burns, or worse. Giovanni had developed his own informal system for testing the quality and safety of his products, but this system was based on limited knowledge and personal experience rather than any scientific understanding of chemistry or toxicology. He would typically test new formulations on himself before offering them to customers, applying small amounts to his skin and observing any immediate reactions. However, this testing could not detect long-term health effects or identify problems that might only become apparent after extended use. The ingredients that Giovanni used varied significantly in quality depending on their source and how they had been stored and transported. Dried herbs might be contaminated with mold or insects, while mineral compounds could contain impurities that affected their properties. Giovanni had learned to recognize some signs of poor quality, such as unusual colors or odors. But many forms of contamination were invisible and undetectable without modern analytical techniques. The lack of standardization in the perfume industry meant that customers never knew exactly what they were getting when they purchased a product. Two perfumes with the same name and supposedly the same formulation could have completely different effects depending on the quality of ingredients used and the skill of the perfume maker who created them. This variability made it difficult for customers to make informed choices and increased the risk of adverse reactions. Giovanni had occasionally received complaints from customers who had experienced problems with his products, ranging from mild skin irritation to more serious allergic reactions. He had learned to take such complaints seriously and to investigate them thoroughly, but he often found it difficult to determine the exact cause of the problem. The same formulation that worked perfectly for one customer might cause severe reactions in another, and Giovanni had no way of predicting which customers might be at risk. The transportation of finished perfumes was also hazardous. Glass containers were fragile and expensive, but there were few alternatives for storing liquids. Broken containers could cause serious cuts, and spilled perfumes often contained caustic or toxic substances that could damage skin or eyes. The roads of Renaissance Europe were rough and dangerous, and perfume makers who traveled to deliver their products faced risks from bandits, accidents, and the general hazards of travel in an era before modern transportation. Giovanni typically delivered his products personally to customers within Florence, using a wooden cart pulled by a horse that he rented from a local stable owner. The cart was equipped with special compartments designed to hold glass containers securely, but the rough cobblestone streets of the city made breakage a constant concern. Giovanni had learned to pack his products carefully using straw, cloth, and other padding materials, but accidents were still common. For deliveries to customers in other cities, Giovanni usually entrusted his products to professional merchants who specialized in transporting valuable goods. These merchants charged substantial fees for their services, but they had experience in protecting fragile items during long journeys. However, Giovanni had no control over how his products were handled. Once they left his workshop, and he sometimes received reports that items had been damaged or contaminated during transport. The roads that connected Italian cities were in poor condition and dangerous to travel. Bandits preyed on merchant caravans, particularly those carrying valuable goods like perfumes. The risk of robbery was so high that merchants often traveled in large groups for protection, but this also made them more conspicuous targets. Giovanni had heard numerous stories of merchants who had been attacked and robbed while transporting perfumes and other luxury goods. Weather conditions could also affect the transportation of perfumes. Rain could seep into supposedly waterproof containers, while extreme heat could cause chemical changes in the products. Cold weather could cause some perfumes to freeze or crystallize, changing their properties and sometimes making them unusable. Giovanni had learned to time his deliveries to avoid the worst weather conditions, but this was not always possible when customers demanded their products urgently. Seasonal variations in the availability of ingredients meant that perfume makers often had to work with materials that were not at their peak quality. Flowers picked too early or too late in the season might contain different concentrations of aromatic compounds, but they might also contain higher levels of toxic substances. The pressure to maintain consistent quality year-round led perfume makers to take risks with ingredients that they might otherwise avoid. Giovanni had developed an intimate knowledge of the seasonal cycles that affected his raw materials, learning when each type of plant was at its peak for perfume making and when it was best to avoid certain ingredients altogether. However, the demands of his business often forced him to use materials that were not at their optimal quality, particularly when customers requested specific formulations during seasons when the ideal ingredients were not available. Spring was generally the best time for gathering fresh flowers, but it was also the season when many plants contained the highest concentrations of toxic compounds. Young leaves and new growth often contained defensive chemicals that plants produced to protect themselves from insects and other threats. Giovanni had learned to be cautious when working with very fresh plant materials, but he sometimes used them anyway when customers specifically requested the intense fragrances that could only be achieved with newly picked materials. Summer brought its own challenges, as the heat could cause plants to wilt and lose their aromatic properties rapidly after harvesting. Giovanni had to work quickly during the hot months to process fresh materials before they spoiled, often working long hours in the already dangerous conditions of his workshop made even more hazardous by the extreme heat. The risk of fires increased during hot weather, as dried materials became more flammable and the heat from distillation equipment became harder to bear. Autumn was traditionally the season for gathering roots, bark, and other materials that were harvested from mature plants. These materials were generally less toxic than fresh growth, but they could also be more difficult to process and sometimes required the use of more aggressive extraction techniques. Giovanni would spend much of the autumn preparing materials that would last through the winter months, working long hours to process and preserve everything before the cold weather made outdoor gathering impossible. Winter presented the challenge of working with stored materials that might have lost some of their potency or developed new properties during storage. Dried herbs could become contaminated with mold or insects if not properly stored, while some materials could undergo chemical changes that made them more or less toxic than when freshly prepared. Giovanni had learned to test stored materials carefully before using them, but he sometimes had to make difficult decisions about whether to use questionable ingredients or disappoint customers by delaying their orders. The lack of medical knowledge during the Renaissance meant that perfume makers had no understanding of the long-term health effects of their work. Symptoms that we would now recognize as signs of heavy metal poisoning, respiratory damage, or chemical exposure were attributed to other causes or simply accepted as the normal hardships of life. Many perfume makers suffered from what they believed were unrelated health problems, not realizing that their daily exposure to toxic substances was slowly destroying their bodies. Giovanni's health had declined gradually over the years in ways that he attributed to the natural process of aging and the physical demands of his work. The tremor in his hands that made delicate work increasingly difficult he blamed on old injuries and the strain of manipulating small tools for hours at a time. The chronic cough that had developed over the years he attributed to the dust and smoke that were inevitable parts of his work environment. The memory problems that Giovanni experienced in his later years were particularly troubling, as his livelihood depended on his ability to remember complex formulations and techniques. He found himself forgetting ingredients or steps in familiar processes, sometimes producing products that were significantly different from what he had intended. These lapses he attributed to stress and overwork, not realizing that they were symptoms of neurological damage caused by chronic exposure to heavy metals and other toxins. Giovanni's digestive problems, which included chronic stomach pain and irregular bowel movements, were symptoms that he shared with many other craftsmen of his era. The common explanation for such problems was poor diet and the stress of working life, but in Giovanni's case, they were likely caused by the gradual accumulation of toxic substances in his system. The lead and mercury that he handled regularly were particularly likely to cause gastrointestinal symptoms. The skin problems that affected many perfume makers were usually attributed to contact with caustic substances or allergic reactions to plant materials. Giovanni's hands had developed a chronic rash that made them painful to use, and his fingernails had become brittle and discolored. These symptoms were so common among perfume makers that they were considered normal occupational hazards, but they were actually signs of systemic poisoning that could have been prevented with proper safety measures. Fire was perhaps the most immediate and obvious danger in any Renaissance perfume workshop. The combination of open flames, flammable liquids, wooden construction, and poor ventilation created conditions that were almost guaranteed to result in catastrophic fires. When fires did occur, they spread rapidly and often destroyed not just the workshop but entire city blocks. The toxic smoke from burning perfume ingredients added another layer of danger, as people trying to escape the fires could be overcome by poisonous fumes. Giovanni had witnessed several fires in perfume workshops during his career, and he had learned to take precautions to reduce the risk in his own workplace. He kept buckets of water and sand available for fighting small fires, and he had developed techniques for quickly extinguishing flames in his distillation equipment. However, the nature of his work made fire prevention extremely difficult, and he accepted the risk as an inevitable part of his profession. The most dangerous fires in perfume workshops were those that involved the large quantities of alcohol that were used as solvents and preservatives. Alcohol vapor could accumulate in poorly ventilated workshops and ignite explosively if exposed to any source of ignition. Giovanni had heard stories of workshops that had been completely destroyed in seconds by alcohol vapor explosions, leaving no time for the occupants to escape. The wooden construction of most Renaissance buildings made fires particularly dangerous, as flames could spread rapidly from one structure to another. Giovanni's workshop was surrounded by other wooden buildings, including the bakery next door with its large ovens and the cloth merchant on the other side with his stores of flammable textiles. A fire in any of these buildings could quickly spread to Giovanni's workshop, while a fire in his workshop could endanger the entire neighborhood. The fire that Giovanni feared most was one that would occur during the night when he was not present to fight it. Such fires could burn undetected for hours before being discovered, giving them time to spread beyond any possibility of control. Giovanni had heard of perfume makers who had lost everything in night fires, not just their workshops and equipment but also their homes and sometimes their lives. The economic instability of the perfume trade meant that many perfume makers lived in constant financial stress, which led them to take shortcuts that increased the dangers of their work. They might use cheaper, more dangerous ingredients, work longer hours without proper rest, or skip maintenance on their equipment to save money. These cost-cutting measures inevitably led to increased risks and more frequent accidents. Giovanni's financial situation had always been precarious, as his income depended on the whims of wealthy customers whose own fortunes could change rapidly. During good times, when his customers were prosperous and generous, Giovanni could afford to purchase the finest ingredients and maintain his equipment properly. During lean periods, however, he was forced to make compromises that increased the risks he faced in his daily work. When money was tight, Giovanni would sometimes purchase ingredients of lower quality or from less reliable sources. These cheaper materials often came with greater risks, as they might be contaminated with harmful substances or processed using dangerous methods. Giovanni had learned to be cautious when dealing with unfamiliar suppliers, but economic pressure sometimes forced him to take risks that he would normally avoid. The maintenance of distillation equipment was another area where Giovanni was sometimes forced to compromise due to financial constraints. The copper vessels and tubes that formed the heart of his operation required regular cleaning and repair to function safely and effectively. When he couldn't afford proper maintenance, Giovanni would sometimes continue using equipment that was corroded or damaged, increasing the risk of leaks, explosions, or contamination. Long working hours were another consequence of financial pressure that increased the dangers Giovanni faced. When he had many orders to fill or complex formulations to develop, he would sometimes work for 16 or 18 hours at a time, continuing long after fatigue had compromised his judgment and coordination. These extended work sessions increased the likelihood of accidents, and made it more difficult for him to recognize the signs of toxic exposure. Competition with imported products added pressure to local perfume makers to create increasingly exotic and complex fragrances. This drove them to experiment with new and untested combinations of ingredients, often without any understanding of the potential chemical reactions that might occur. The race to create the next fashionable fragrance led to a culture of experimentation that prioritized novelty over safety. The perfume markets of Renaissance Europe were increasingly dominated by products imported from distant lands, particularly from the Middle East and Asia, where perfume making had reached high levels of sophistication. These imported perfumes often had complex, exotic fragrances that were difficult for European perfume makers to duplicate using locally available ingredients. Giovanni felt constant pressure to match the quality and uniqueness of these foreign products while working with more limited resources. The competition from imported perfumes forced Giovanni to experiment with ingredients and techniques that were outside his normal experience. He would sometimes attempt to recreate exotic fragrances by combining familiar materials in new ways, or by using local plants that he hoped might provide similar aromatic properties to foreign ingredients. These experiments often involved combining substances that had never been mixed before, creating unpredictable chemical reactions that could be dangerous. Giovanni's efforts to compete with imported products sometimes led him to take risks with ingredients that he would normally avoid. If a customer specifically requested a fragrance that matched an imported perfume, Giovanni might be tempted to use dangerous materials or experimental techniques in an attempt to satisfy the customer's expectations. The fear of losing business to foreign competitors could override his natural caution about working with unfamiliar or hazardous substances. The pressure to innovate also led Giovanni to experiment with processing techniques that were more aggressive or complex than traditional methods. He might use higher temperatures, stronger acids, or more prolonged extraction processes in an attempt to achieve effects that were not possible with conventional techniques. These experimental methods often increased the risks he faced, as they involved working with more extreme conditions and more reactive substances. The apprenticeship system, while providing a way for young people to learn the trade, also perpetuated dangerous practices. Master perfume makers who had survived years of exposure to toxic substances often suffered from neurological damage that affected their judgment and memory. They might forget important safety procedures or make errors in formulations that put their apprentices at risk. The knowledge that was passed down from master to apprentice often included dangerous practices alongside legitimate techniques. Giovanni had learned his trade from a master who had worked in the perfume business for more than 40 years, a man whose vast experience came with the price of chronic health problems that affected his ability to teach effectively. The master's hands shook constantly from what Giovanni now suspected had been mercury poisoning, and his memory was unreliable, especially for details of complex formulations. Despite these problems, the master possessed knowledge and skills that could not be learned from books or other sources. The relationship between master and apprentice was based on personal trust and loyalty rather than formal safety protocols or systematic training programs. Giovanni had learned by watching his master work and by gradually taking on more responsibility for dangerous tasks. The master had shared his knowledge freely, but he had also passed on practices and assumptions that were based on incomplete understanding of the risks involved. Many of the techniques that Giovanni had learned from his master were inherently dangerous, but they were presented as normal and necessary aspects of the trade. The casual handling of toxic substances, the acceptance of chronic health problems as occupational hazards, and the prioritization of product quality over worker safety were all attitudes that Giovanni had absorbed during his apprenticeship. He had, in turn, passed these same attitudes on to his own apprentices, perpetuating dangerous practices across generations. The informal nature of apprenticeship training meant that important safety information might be lost or forgotten if a master became ill or died before completing an apprentice's training. Giovanni had witnessed cases where apprentices were left to complete their training with masters who were too ill to provide proper guidance, or where young people were forced to learn dangerous techniques through trial and error after their masters had died. Weather conditions greatly affected the safety of perfume-making operations. High humidity could cause certain chemical reactions to occur more rapidly or unpredictably. Cold weather made it necessary to heat workshops, increasing the fire risk. Hot weather accelerated the evaporation of volatile compounds, increasing the concentration of toxic vapors in the air. Perfume makers had to adapt their practices to changing conditions, often without fully understanding the implications of these adaptations. During periods of high humidity, Giovanni found that many of his normal techniques produced different results than expected. Materials that normally remain stable for weeks or months might begin to ferment or undergo chemical changes within days. The moisture in the air could also interfere with drying processes and make it difficult to achieve the proper consistency in powdered materials. Cold weather presented its own set of challenges, as Giovanni needed to heat his workshop to maintain working conditions while also operating equipment that required open flames. The combination of heating fires, distillation equipment, and the natural combustibility of his materials created an extremely dangerous situation during winter months. The need to keep doors and windows closed to conserve heat also reduced ventilation, increasing the concentration of toxic vapors in the workshop. Hot weather was perhaps the most dangerous condition for perfume making, as high temperatures accelerated the evaporation of volatile compounds and increased the risk of fires and explosions. During summer heat waves, Giovanni would sometimes be forced to work in temperatures that exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions that made it difficult to think clearly and increased the likelihood of accidents. The heat also caused stored materials to deteriorate more rapidly, sometimes producing toxic decomposition products. Sudden changes in weather could be particularly problematic, as they might cause materials that had been stable under one set of conditions to become unstable when conditions changed. Giovanni had learned to monitor weather patterns carefully and to adjust his work schedule to avoid the most dangerous conditions, but he was not always able to predict or control the effects of weather on his materials and processes. As the years passed and Giovanni's hair turned gray, and the tremor in his hands became more pronounced, he began to understand, in some dim way, that his chosen profession had exacted a price that went far beyond the obvious cuts, burns, and accidents that marked the daily life of a craftsman. The young man who had eagerly begun his apprenticeship decades earlier, filled with dreams of creating beautiful fragrances for wealthy patrons, had been slowly transformed into someone whose body bore the invisible scars of countless exposures to toxic substances. Yet Giovanni continued his work, as did countless other perfume makers across Europe, driven by the same forces that had motivated craftsmen for centuries: the pride of creating something beautiful, the satisfaction of mastering a complex and demanding skill, and the hope of prosperity through dedication and hard work. They could not have known that their pursuit of beauty was slowly killing them, any more than they could have imagined the sophisticated understanding of chemistry and toxicology that would one day make their craft safe. In the end, the story of Giovanni Di Marco and his fellow Renaissance perfume makers serves as a reminder of the price that has often been paid for human progress and artistic achievement. Their willingness to risk their health and safety in pursuit of their craft laid the foundation for the modern perfume industry, which continues to bring pleasure and beauty to millions of people around the world. Their sacrifices, made in ignorance of the true costs, help us appreciate both how far we have come in protecting workers from occupational hazards and how much we owe to those who came before us. The next time you apply perfume or appreciate a beautiful fragrance, take a moment to remember Giovanni and the countless other craftsmen like him who risked everything to develop the knowledge and techniques that make modern perfumery possible. Their legacy lives on not just in the bottles on our dressing tables, but in our understanding of the importance of workplace safety and the protection of human health. In their courage and dedication, despite the dangers they faced, we can see the very best of the human spirit, the willingness to pursue beauty and excellence regardless of personal cost.